Why would a normal guy be willing to get arrested? My name is Ernst-Jan Kuiper. I consider myself to be a normal guy. And up here you see a picture of me and my fellow rebels taken last October. And this was about 10 seconds before I got arrested. And I spent almost 10 hours in jail that day. Tonight I want to tell you why I joined Extinction Rebellion and why I'm willing to get arrested to fight climate change. After I finished high school at the age of 18, I decided to take a gap year, and I traveled with a friend of mine through countries like Chile and Argentina and Bolivia and Peru. And the Andes mountain range made such an impression on me that I decided that I wanted to study geology the following year. But during my bachelor, I realized that although geology is interesting, for me the climate system was more interesting. So I switched after I finished my bachelor from geology to climate physics. And the climate system is this really fascinating system, and it's incredibly complex. And since climate science is a relatively young science, we have not been doing this stuff for so long. There's still a lot to discover. I also realized that I like doing science, and especially in this field. So I decided to apply for a PhD position. And sometime later, I was hired to undertake a project that studied ice flow in the Greenland ice sheet. And at the end of my PhD project, I got to join an expedition to the Greenland ice sheet. Up here, you see a picture of me just after we landed on top of the Greenland ice sheet. And my 6.5-week stay on top of the Greenland ice sheet was one of the most fascinating experiences of my life. And I feel really privileged to have been to such a remote, cold, and lonely place. However, during those years that I was studying the climate system, I also got more worried about the threats of climate change. The science is crystal clear. The path that we're following is completely unsustainable, and it will lead to widespread climate disruption. So I started to do what most people do. I tried to reduce my own carbon footprint. So I started to eat less meat, and I became a vegetarian sometime later. I started to fly less. I voted for the Green parties. You know the story. But it didn't take long before I realized I'm not going to stop climate change all by myself. These small contributions do not add up. So after a while, I walked a number of climate marches. I started and signed a whole bunch of petitions. And I joined a campaign that asked my pension fund to sell their shares in fossil fuel companies. So for a couple of years, on the one hand, I was working full-time on my PhD project. And on the other hand, I was spending a few hours a week on this type of climate activism. And the feeling that you're doing something to fight climate change and that you're raising awareness is really good. But I always had this feeling in the back of my mind that we were not accomplishing very much, and that our concerns were not heard by the people in power, and that business as usual continued more or less unopposed. And I think the best example of this was that after last year's climate march in The Hague in September, I think, which was attended by 35,000 people, the reaction of our Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, was, "Thank you, we got the message." And then nothing changed and everything went back to normal. During those years that I studied the climate system, the warnings from the climate scientists were also getting louder. And it's not just that our emissions continue to go up each year, which is obviously making the crisis worse. But it is also that climate scientists now realize that the climate system is much more vulnerable than they thought only about a decade ago. The poles, and especially the Arctic, are warming up faster than predicted. Coral reefs are dying at an unprecedented rate. We all have seen the forest fires in Australia the last month. And permafrost is melting decades earlier than predicted by the climate models. But actually what is even more terrifying is that we are rapidly approaching tipping points in the climate system. And just to give you an example of what a tipping point is, there's a great deal of permafrost in places like Siberia and Canada and Alaska. And this permafrost contains a lot of carbon in the form of organic matter. And when this permafrost starts to thaw, it releases carbon dioxide and methane, which are greenhouse gases, which cause more warming, which cause more permafrost to thaw. So if this carbon bomb, if I may call it that, goes off, humanity is in deep, deep trouble, because the amount of carbon stored in the permafrost is estimated to be about twice as much carbon as there's currently in the atmosphere. Now, this is just one tipping point, or what scientists like to call feedback loops. And by now, scientists have identified about a dozen of them in the climate system. And it is unclear how unstable these feedback loops actually are. In the meantime, the biologists are warning us that the planet has entered the sixth mass extinction event. The last mass extinction event, which happened 65 million years ago, the fifth one, killed off the dinosaurs. And it is estimated that up to 1 million species might go extinct within the next 3 decades. But you don't have to take these warnings from me. Take the warning from the 15,000 scientists that signed the scientists' second warning to humanity. We face deforestation, ocean acidification, diminishing fresh water supplies, the Earth's sixth mass extinction event, exponential human population growth, overconsumption, and a climate system veering outside of the conditions within which human civilization developed. It is papers and warnings like these that made me realize that humanity is sleepwalking into a catastrophe, and that the people in power are doing virtually nothing to stop it. So after I finished my PhD dissertation and I handed it in and I defended it in the beginning of 2019, I decided to join Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion had just been founded in the UK, and there they had shown that they have a completely different approach to dealing with this crisis. First of all, Extinction Rebellion is brutally honest about the extent of the crisis that humanity is in. We have just entered the sixth mass extinction event, and if we continue like this, our children will inherit a planet that is hostile to human life. And by the way, most other life forms too. The politicians who have known about this crisis and have been warned about this crisis for over 30 years have done virtually nothing to stop it. And even now, they only talk about the problem, but they refuse to take any serious measures. Even if all the countries in the world would do what they promise, would do what they have promised, the planet will heat up by about 3 to 4 degrees, and possibly 5. Now, if we reach these kinds of temperatures, most ecosystems will have collapsed. And it is almost certain that we've passed a number of the tipping points that I just mentioned. The world's leading climatologists are unsure if human civilizations can survive a 4-degree world. And just as a reminder, this is the case if all countries do what they promised, which we all know is pretty unlikely, and has almost never happened in the past. The politicians who have a constitutional duty to keep their population safe are simply failing to do so. And therefore, in Extinction Rebellion, we say that the social contract has been broken. And the social contract means something like you, as a citizen, you pay taxes and you obey the law. And in exchange for that, the government keeps you safe and takes care of your well-being. Now, the unwillingness of our government to deal with this climate and ecological crisis shows us that this social contract is no longer valid. They have broken the social contract without telling us. And by doing so, they're putting your lives, and particularly the lives of your children and grandchildren, in danger. So ask yourself, do you really have to obey the laws that the government sets if that same government is putting your life and the lives of your children in danger? In Extinction Rebellion, we say that we have a right to rebel against our government. But how do you do that? Rebelling against the government. The social sciences are very clear. 2 conditions should be met for a successful rebellion. The first condition is that your protest or your rebellion needs to be disruptive. Because if you do not disrupt daily life, then the elite simply won't care, like we've seen with all these climate marches. The second condition is that you have to stay non-violent. Even if the state starts to use violence, which they will, and when they start to arrest people, which they also will, we will stay non-violent. And in the case of getting arrested, it is only about 10 or 20% of the people in a protest that get arrested. And these are the people who are willing to do so, and they take on these high-risk roles. We prepare them well for their arrest, and we take care of them afterwards, both legally and mentally. So staying non-violent is not just a moral thing to do. It is also the best tactic we have in creating the large-scale societal change that we so desperately need. And one of the reasons why non-violent movements are so successful is because non-violent movements are very inclusive. For example, this 75-year-old man is willing to join a non-violent protest, while it is quite unlikely that this same man would have joined a protest that involved any form of violence. And because of this, non-violent movements tend to grow very fast until they reach a certain critical size at which the government cannot deal with the protest anymore and the police cannot lock any more people up. And that is exactly where we want the government to be, because that's the moment they have to come in and negotiate with the protesters. And this has already happened between Extinction Rebellion UK and the UK government. And when this happens, we as Extinction Rebellion have 3 demands for the government, which are the same in every country where we are active. The first demand is that the government has to start to tell the truth about the extent of the ecological and climate crisis and communicate the urgency for change. So no longer, like they're doing now, pretending that this will be fine and that this is a minor issue, but admit that this is an existential crisis and declare a climate emergency. The second demand is that the government has to start to act now, and we need to become carbon neutral by 2025 and hold all further biodiversity laws. Now, becoming carbon neutral in 2025 will cause a major societal change, unprecedented in peacetime. But by now, it is the best option we have of passing on a planet that is still habitable to our grandchildren. And the last demand is, I think, the most exciting one, because it says that we want the formation of a citizens' assembly. And a citizens' assembly means that we pick 100 to 150 people from the population by sortition, and these people reflect the population in terms of age, in terms of gender, and income, and ethnicity, and all of that. And these people get access to all the literature that they need on this topic. They can talk to experts and stakeholders. And crucially, they also get plenty of time to talk to each other and exchange ideas. Because every politician knows how the climate and the ecological crisis can be solved. The problem is that no politician knows how to get re-elected afterwards. And therefore, they either ignore the problem, completely deny it, or, like now, pretend to solve it. Now, the people in the Citizens' Assembly do not have this problem, because they're people like you and me, and we have not been affected by decades of party politics. And we also do not have the ambition to run for re-election. And therefore, the experience has shown that citizens' assemblies are a very good way at breaking this type of political stalemate. A citizens' assembly also ensures that the costs of the energy transition will be paid for by the people who can afford it, and the companies who have done all the polluting. And not like we're seeing now, where the general population pays higher taxes, and companies like Shell get tax breaks and subsidies. Now, you might still think that what Extinction Rebellion is doing is radical. But then I'm asking you, how did major societal change happen throughout history. How did Martin Luther King Jr. achieve success? How did women finally get the right to vote? How was apartheid finally broken in South Africa? And how was, and still is, the LGBT community fighting for equal rights? Now, none of these movements were effective by going to the ballot box or by signing petitions. These movements were successful after thousands of people hit the street, protested, and often broke the law. And back then, these movements were condemned by politicians and often seen as criminal. But now we see them as being on the right side of history. Now, all that Extinction Rebellion is doing is copying the tactics of these social movements. And from that perspective, what we're doing is not so radical. It's perfectly rational. And even the 15,000 scientists that I mentioned earlier, they also agree that one of the best ways we have of getting politicians to act is by mass grassroots mobilization. Now, on April 13th, we'll have our next rebellion in The Hague. I hope you will be there too. Because if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? Thank you.